Hey everyone, welcome to part 12 of this Python tutorial series for beginners. In this final chapter, our goal is to take everything we've learned so far and use it to build a project. When you eventually become a software engineer, your day-to-day job usually involves receiving a list of requirements or specifications for a problem that is unclear and vague. And your role is to sort of interpret that problem and find a way to turn it into a program or an application. You'll start with a problem that you want to solve, and then you'll have to break that problem down piece by piece, and then use all the things you've learned to try and solve them. And a lot of times, your knowledge might not even be enough. So you probably have to also expand your knowledge and learn new things in order to solve the problem. This is a very normal and typical process that software engineers have to go through when they're working on a project. And so we're going to go and do exactly all of that today to prepare you for the future. The goal of this project is to create a Python app that lets you, as a user, track and categorize your monthly expenses and to help you budget for that month. Here's a preview of what the app would look like in the command line or in the terminal once we've finished building it. So the app will let users type their expense category and their amount directly into the terminal. So for example, here I could type in, I had a cheeseburger for lunch, so that would be in the food category, and then I can type in the price of maybe $12. The program will save or append that expense into a file. So this is going to be a CSV file. And finally, we're going to read all of the expense entries in that file, including the one we just added, so that we can summarize the expense totals for that month. And we might even want to be able to sort them by category. And after that, we'll tell the user how much money they can spend for the rest of the month to stay in budget. And this budget could be a custom amount that we put in, for example, $2,000. So in this example case here, we've got a couple of expenses already in our food, home, and fun categories, and we have about $1,200 left to spend for this month. So that's roughly $60 per day. And that would probably look at the date of the month as well. So we might need to know how to get the date from Python. Since we're also writing out the results into a CSV file, the output of this app will be compatible with Excel or Google Drive, so that if you decide to extend the app later or to build more capabilities, your output will be usable across other apps and services. And I think a key of building a good app or a useful app is to think about how you're going to integrate it with other workflows in your life. So it's always good to think about how you can make an output that you can then use as part of a different app or a different workflow. So that's why we're going to export it to a CSV file, which is a universally accepted spreadsheet standard. The first step to building a successful app is to be very clear on our requirements. I've written out the requirements here, and you could use these requirements if you want, or you can modify them to have your own set of goals. But the ones I'm going to use are these four. So users will enter their expense. So we're going to need some kind of input. And then we want to save the expense to a CSV file. So we'll need to be able to write to a file on our disk. And then we want to summarize the expense totals. So we'll have to look at the file, and the file will have all the expenses we've ever added using this app, and then we want to summarize that. And then after that, we want to show the remaining budget. So let's assume that we do this on a monthly basis, and this file represents the spending for a month. If we have a budget in mind for the month, maybe say $2,000, then we can take the total and subtract that to figure out how much we have left for the month. And we can even do a day-by-day breakdown. When I start a coding project, I like to have requirements like these sort of written down or pinned up somewhere on a note or in a file, just so that I can refer to them and make sure that I'm solving the right problem. So feel free to do that if you want, or just take a screenshot of this and keep it on the side, because this is what we're going to build. Now, before we get started writing code, I think a good idea is to kind of just sketch out the whole design for the project on a piece of paper. So here, I'm trying to capture all the things that I want to do with this project in one diagram. I'm going to have two files. So you could see here on the left, I've got my expense.py file. And that's because an expense has three pieces of information that I care about. It's got the name, which is probably going to be a string. It's got a category, also a string, and it's got an amount. So for example, if I was tracking my food expense, then the name could be something like sushi or burger or lunch or coffee or whatever. And then the category could all be food. And then I could have different categories like food, bills, entertainment, rent, etc. and the amount is obviously the dollar amount of that expense. The reason I want a class for this is because I want to store all these three pieces of information as one unit, and we saw that classes are pretty useful for that. So I'd rather use that than another data structure like a dictionary or a list, which, I mean, you can store those three pieces of information, but you don't have a nice interface. You can't refer to each of these variables by its name quite easily. So once I have that class, I want to import it into my other app. And the reason I separate these two files is because I want all the logic to be in one place, and I want my data model, which is the expense in this case, to be in another place. It's also just a way to organize our apps a little bit better. It's not nice to have too much stuff in one file. So I'm just trying to find a way to split it out a little bit. And my expense tracker app is the one that I'm actually going to run from my terminal. And then we're going to do three main things. So the number one thing we have to do is first ask for input from the user. So we already know how to do that. We'll just get them to type something in. And once they type something in, we want to write it to the file. And we also know how to do that. So we've got this little arrow with the W. We're writing to an expenses.csv file. And then after that, we want to show the summary. So we have to read all the information from the file and then do some math to get the totals and show how much budget we have left for that month. So keep this plan in mind, and you could even add to this or write your own plan if you want, but it's important to have a plan when you start writing the code. All right, let's hop over to our editor and get started. Just open up your VS Code editor in a new folder, a fresh folder where you can work on this. We don't want to be confused by other files in this folder. And here I just have a folder called Sandbox, which I've been using throughout this whole tutorial, but I've deleted everything from there. So you shouldn't have other files in here in case it messes with something that you're doing. So once we have that, let's create a new file. And the first file I'm going to create is the expenses class. I'm going to call this expense.py. And here it's going to be the class that stores our expense information. And if you recall, classes need a constructor method. So that's def and then init. And we need three pieces of information with our expenses. So we need self.name, and we have to pass this in through the constructor. So we'll have to make these arguments as well. And we'll also need category and an amount. Now that's really all we need for the class for now, so we can use it as an expense, and then we'll have these three variables stored inside each instance of the class. Okay, so now let's move on to our main app. And I'm going to call this expensetracker.py. And when I run the app, I want that flow, like that main piece of code that I'm running, to be inside one function. Up till now, we've written our Python scripts as if the whole thing was being run, but I really don't quite like that, because when you import a Python file into another Python script, it will run everything in that file. So unless you want that to happen, it's better to keep them in functions, and then we can decide which pieces to run and when. But if you create an app that's supposed to be run as the main application like this, it's typical to name the main function main. And now I want to run this main function when I run the class. So I could do something like this, but this will still execute if I ever import this into another class. Now, why would I want to import expense tracker into another class? Because I thought we were going to make this as the main thing we run. Well, it turns out that a lot of the times you build Python apps and Python scripts, but then you have ideas to make it part of another app or make it part of an automated workflow. So you end up kind of reusing your file or your code. And if you just put it like this, as soon as you import that, this main is going to run, and we don't like that. To make sure that this runs only when we run this file and not when we run it as part of another file, there's a trick we can do, which is to put a condition. And the condition we can use is if name equals main. Now, to break down what this means, this underscore name is a special variable in Python. It will be equal to double underscore main when we run this as a file. So this will only be true when we run it directly instead of importing it. Therefore, by putting this condition, we can run our app only when we run it directly. So if you ever see this structure in Python apps, this is what it's doing. So now we have our main function. The first thing I'm going to do is run it and make sure that it's actually running properly. So I'm just going to add a print statement here. Then I'm going to just hit this play button. And you can see that this is printed out. Our main function and our condition is working properly. The next thing we need to do is break down our problems into small pieces. Remember, I said that this was one of the steps we had to do. So if we start to write the code for our app right away, it's going to become pretty overwhelming. I recommend we first write comments instead of code, just to guide what we're doing. The first thing that we were going to do is to get user to input their expense. And then after that, we want to write it to a file. And finally, we want to read the file and summarize all the expenses. Great, so now we've broken our Python app into 3 different problems we have to solve. Now, rather than writing the code directly here, it's good to put them into their own function as well, because then our scope will be small. We just have to figure out one function at a time instead of trying to write the whole program at once. So let's start with this first one, get user input for expense. So here, I'm just going to create an empty function. And again, it might be a good idea to just print something and just get the whole structure validated first before we start writing any code. And now I'm going to use this function right here where I want to get the use input for expense. And I'm just going to copy paste this for the other 2 tasks that we have to do. Okay, so now I have 3 empty functions, one for each part of the application, and I'm using them here in the main application. And when this main function is run, it's going to run each of these sub-functions one by one in this order, and that pretty much summarizes our expense tracking app. So I don't need these pass statements anymore since I actually have print statements inside these functions, so I don't need those. And now let's go ahead and run this just to make sure that we haven't broken anything. So here's my output. You could see that the structure of the app is in place. We run the expense tracker, we get the user expense, we save it, and then we summarize it. So now let's move on to actually implementing these things. So now let's implement the get user expense function. We actually have 3 pieces of information that we need from the user: the name, category, and the amount. So let's start with the name and the amount because that's pretty straightforward. So here, we're just going to write an input function, Python's inbuilt input function, and then put in a prompt. And here, I'm just going to say enter expense name. And we want to store the output of this function into a variable. So I'm going to call it expense name. So that's a new variable that I'm creating there to store this information. And as I'm building this out, I also want to test it. So I'm just going to have a test print statement here. And this is a format string, so I need an F at the front. And so now if I run this, I can constantly see my output. So let's not get ahead of ourselves too far and just test this simple part. So my expense name is going to be sushi, and then you can see here it says you've entered sushi. Okay, so that works. Now let's also get the expense amount. Pretty easy. We're just going to copy paste this entire line and then change this to expense amount. And we probably want to cast this into a float as well. Otherwise, it's going to stay as a string. So remember, all inputs return strings. We have to explicitly turn it into a number. So we're going to cast it by doing this. And let's also print that out. So testing it again, just to make sure we're sane. Then $10, and this seems to work. So this line is correct. Now the categories is a little bit harder. I want only a set amount of categories, and I want the user to choose from one of them. So I don't want them to enter their own category, because that can lead to bad things happening. For example, they could enter house or rent for one of them, but they mean the same thing. So that's pretty complicated. Instead, we're just going to have them select from a list. So to do this, we need to first define a list of categories for them to choose from. So I'm going to do it here. I'm going to create a list called expense categories. And to create a list, we use these square brackets. And now I'm just going to put a list of different items in. So maybe food, home, so that could be rent or mortgage or bills, and maybe work, and fun, and then maybe miscellaneous for everything else. And just to make this a little bit more visual as we're building this out, I'm going to add emojis to each of these names as well. Okay, so now we have our list of categories. We want our user to see that list and choose from one of them. So what I'm going to do is present them with a list and have each item have a number on it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then the user will select one of these numbers. And if they select something that isn't a number or the number's out of range, then we will basically just tell them to do it again. And the way we can do this is to use a while loop. That way we can keep repeating the prompt for the user until we get a valid input, which is one of these categories. And if they enter something that's not correct, we'll just tell them to do it again. So let's go with that. And I'm going to use a while true here. You always have to be careful using a while true loop, because if you don't break out of the loop, this will continue to loop forever. But we're going to do while true, and then I'm going to prompt them to select a category. So I'm going to print out select a category. Now I need to show them the list of categories that they can choose from. And I could do that outside of the loop as well, but I want to reprompt it just in case they kind of scrolled past it or whatever. So that's why I'm doing it within this loop. And to do that, I'm going to enumerate through each of these category items so that I have the number as well, and then print that number alongside the name of the category. And if you remember from the looping tutorial, if we use this enumerate function with a list, we get a tuple response, which is the index of an item and also the value of the item. So we'll use that. And now I want to print the index and also the name. So let's create a format string, because we want to have two pieces of information here, and then put the index, and I'll put a dot, and then I'll put the name. And maybe I want to add some spaces here as well, so that when we print it out, it looks indented, so it visually stands out. Whoops, I also need this in the squiggly brackets so that it actually substitutes the value. Before we test the input, I'm going to break this while loop right here so that we just see if this looks correct. And let's run that again. So if enter expense name, I'm just going to enter anything now. And now we can see select a category and each of these show up. But this is a little bit weird. So the first item starts with 0. And that's typical for programmers and lists. I mean, we know that index starts at 0, but for most normal people, they expect to start the first item at 1. So let's put I plus 1 so that it matches that expectation. And let's run it again, and now we have the index starting at 1. So people can select from 1 to 5. And let's store the selected index as a variable. And it's going to be input, enter category number. And with things that a user has to select like this, I also like to put in a range of values that they can choose from. So let's make a string to store that information. And I'm going to format it like this, just put it in some kind of brackets. And we're going to go from, well, 1 to however many is in this category. So let's put length of the category, which should be 5. Oh, not this one, sorry. It will be the list. So now I have this value range string, which is gonna be 1 to 5. And I want to show this alongside my prompt. So let's just sneak that in there. And then we'll have to turn this into a f string as well. Okay, let's take a break and test this. So expense name and amount, and then here we go. Enter a category number 1 to 5. And right now we enter anything, it doesn't matter. Nothing happens. Now, because we want to compare this index to the range of our list, we need to convert this into an integer. So let's go ahead and cast that. And this will work if people enter weird numbers like -1 or whatever, but I think it might break if they try to enter something that's completely not a number, like a string, like ABC. So that's something that we can handle as well, but I'm going to ignore that for now and just assume that our user is good intentioned and they will enter a number. Now, we need to see if the selected index is in the range of these items. So we're looking for if that input is in between the number 1 to the number 5. But remember, we actually added 1 to these numbers. So we're actually needing to subtract that as well. Because if the user enters 1, the index they really want is index 0, because this is index 0 according to Python. So we have to add a -1 to that. And now I can check if this is in the range of 0 to 5. Remember, when we check if something is in the range of something, it doesn't include the last number. So if you check if something is in range of 5, it checks that if the number is between 0 and 4, up to 4. That's just how it works. So let's just write that out and maybe it'll be more clear. If the selected index is in the range, again, this is one of the functions we learned for looping, and we could do this as well, where we just check for membership in this iterator. And then we can put 0 to 5 if we want, and that would do the same thing. Or if we don't put the first argument, it's always going to assume it's going from 0 to this number. But better than hard coding this number, we want to make it bound to this list, because if this list changes, we don't want to have to update this part here as well. It's really bad design if you ever have to update code in 2 or more places to make something work. Ideally, you only have to update code in 1 place, and that behavior will be inferred by the rest of your code. So let's go ahead and do that. And we know that this is 5. So this should be in range 5, which means that it's valid if it's 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, because range is not inclusive of its maximum boundary. Now, if we've selected the correct index, we're done with this part and we can break. So here I'm going to type my break statement. But if we don't, then I'm going to show a message that it was invalid, and we're going to just repeat that loop again. So now I don't need this break statement anymore, and I can test this again. Okay, so let's enter something invalid, like 7. And it says invalid category, please try again. So let's say 0, and that doesn't work either. So let's try 2. And that works, and now the app exits. Now, just to show you, I'm kind of curious what happens if I enter something like ABC. Okay, so you can see that it completely breaks because it can't cast something like ABC to an integer. And we haven't covered how to handle this yet, so we're going to ignore it for now. But just so you know, if you come across something like this and there's an error, the way you can handle it is using something called a try statement. And we didn't cover this because we didn't cover error handling, but that's something for you to look into later on if you have time as a way to handle this. Basically, what this will do is that if whatever is in the scope of the try statement has an error, instead of crashing the app like you see here, we can actually catch that error and then we can decide what to do there. So it would look something like this: try, except, and then you put in the name of the error. And then here you could do something with it. But don't worry about that for now. We're not going to purposely crash our app. Okay, so now once the user has chosen their category, we have everything we need to produce this expense object. I'm going to delete this debugging line because we don't need it anymore. And that expense object is going to be the combination of the name, the amount, and the category. So what I'm going to do is, instead of actually breaking this loop, I can just return the value from here. And that will also break the loop because we're actually exiting this entire function. And I want this function to produce an expense back to this main part of the application so we can use it with the other sub-functions. So I'm going to go ahead and create a variable to store the result of this. And then here, I'm going to return that expense. Now, I'm going to delete the break. And I'm going to create a new expense. I'm going to call it new expense as a variable name, just to be clear that it's a new one. I don't want to get it confused with this one, which I'm using here. So always try to have very specific names for each scope of your program so you don't get them mixed up by accident. And then I need to use my expense class that I've created. But it's in a different file, so it doesn't discover it. If I mouse over it, it says expense is not defined. If you're using VS Code, most of the time it will figure out that you need to import a file. So if you see this quick fix button and press the hotkey, it will usually come up with the suggestion. And if you press that, you go to the top of the file, you'll see it's using this import statement from expense, import expense. But if your VS Code or your editor doesn't suggest that, then you can just enter this line manually. And this looks in the file that you run Python from. So if you run Python from this file, as you can see in my terminal, I'm actually in this file right now. This is my location. It will discover it here. But if I go to a different file and try to run it, or I move this expense to a different module, it won't discover that. So you have to keep that in mind, is that when you write these import statements, it's from the perspective of the Python interpreter and where that is currently running. When I was a beginner at Python, I made a ton of mistakes where I put the file in the slightly wrong folder, or I'm running the interpreter from a different folder and my imports would just break. So to solve that, you need to look at your project topology, which is the structure of where the files are in relation to each other. And you'll probably discover maybe there's a disconnect somewhere, or maybe a file's in the wrong place and you have to fix that. So with this import statement, this expense class that we've created right at the start is now available in this file. And we're going to use it here. So we're going to create a new expense and we're going to construct it with the values that we've taken from our user. So expense name equals this name here. And I'm going to use keyword arguments because it's more clear what they do. So I don't accidentally put things in the wrong order. You can always mouse over classes to see their signature, which will tell you how to construct one. And the next one is the category. But I actually don't have the category that I've selected yet. I've got the list of categories and I've got the index. To get the actual category name, I actually have to create another variable. So I'm going to call it selected category. And that is going to be the expense categories. And I'm going to access the item at this index. And then I'll use expenses categories and selected index. So now I should have the selected category as a string. And I'll set that to my degree here. And finally, I need my amount. So my new expense is created and it's an instance of this expense class. And I'm just going to return that as the output of my function. So now get users expense is done. And I'm going to click on this little arrow here to collapse it. So I don't have to look at that anymore. But now I want to test it. So let's print out the expense once we have gotten it from the user input. Let's run the app, enter expense name, amount, doesn't matter what it is at this point. And we have it printed out here, but it's this memory address again. So this is not useful because it doesn't tell me that I've created my object properly. So how do we fix this? How do we print it out so that when we use the print statement with this object, it shows something useful instead of the memory address? I mean, this is useless to me. Well, we can actually do that in Python because there's a default function that comes with all classes that tells you how to represent it as a string when you try to print it out. And that special function is called --repr, which I guess stands for representation, but I could be wrong, but it doesn't matter. So just type _REPR and then _ again, and then self is the only argument it needs. And here we return a string that we want to show when we print it instead of this thing. So here I'm just going to write expense Actually might put it into some brackets as well so that we know it's an object being printed out. And I'm going to substitute some of these values. So name, category, and amount. And with the amount, I might want to format it as a $sign. Also, I can use formatting hints inside this format string. So for example, if I want to cap this at 2 decimal places, I can do something like this. Okay, so now with this inbuilt function overridden, I can run this again, and hopefully now this will be something descriptive when we run it. So let's go back to our expense tracker and run that again. Expense name, sushi, expense amount, $10, and category food. And see here, we've replaced our memory address with something actually useful. Now let's move on to the next section of our app, which is to save the expense into a file. This function needs to take in an argument, which is the expense, because that's what we want to save. And we'll put it here in the function signature as well. And here, when I'm printing this line out, I can now make it display the expense that I'm trying to save. So I don't need this debugging line anymore because it's going to be printed out when I try to save the expense to file here instead. Now to save something to a file, I first need to open the file. And to open the file, I need to know the file name. And since I'm going to read the file later with my summarized expenses, I probably want to use the name as a constant, or I might want it as a second argument. For now, I'm just going to pass it in as an argument. Using global constants is quite dangerous because it makes it hard to debug your app and to be sure which variables you're actually using. So let's start by declaring a file name. Or maybe even path. And here I'm just going to call it expenses.csv. So now I'll need to pass this in to this function as well, save to file. And I might as well pass it into summarize expenses function as well. Okay, and now the signature also needs to accept that path. All right, so now we have our file path. Let's open the file with open, and then for the first argument, it's going to be the file path. Second argument is going to be the mode, but we don't want to overwrite the file, so we're going to use A for append, and this will add whatever we want to the existing file. So we're just going to add to the file. And if the file doesn't exist, it will create it. We have to do as f. Once we have this f variable, we can use that to write things to the file. Now, since it's a CSV file, CSV stands for comma separated value, we want to write each of our expense variables one by one and separate it with a comma. We will probably use a format string for that. I'm just going to go ahead and do that because there's 3 values. And at the end, we're going to need a new line character so that each of these appear on a different row. So I'm just going to put that in now before we forget. And now we can fill these in. So we've got our expense here, and we'll just fill it in with each item. The expense name, the expense category, or amount, I guess. Depends. It doesn't matter what order you put them in, as long as you remember it and you're consistent with it. Let me tell you something. This is super annoying to me because I'm typing the name of these variables, but if I don't remember them or I make a mistake, then I have no way to tell what it is. So if you're using Python, I think maybe Python 3.8 or 3.6 or above, it's got this thing called type hints, which says that if you know what type of item this expense is going to be, you can hint your editor to know about it so that it suggests you these fields, right? So you saw me, I had to like type in these things manually, and I could make a mistake. I could like misspell it or, you know, do something and not realize that, and this would just crash. But instead, if we put a type hint, so I know this is an expense, and you just put the name of the class or the name of the type, you just do it with a colon. So this is a type hint. Now, when I use this object here, my editor is going to be smart enough to suggest me all the things I can do with it. Watch this. If I press the dot now, it actually shows up with each of the possible fields I could use. And then if I put in something it doesn't recognize, you could see that it's highlighted weirdly because it doesn't know that it belongs to this thing. So that's pretty useful, type hints. So we'll put the name, amount, and then the category. So I think this should work, and let's just go ahead and test that. Let's clear this and run it. Enter expense name. So let's put burger, $12, and then category food. Okay, so everything seems to work fine, no errors, and I see this debugging line saving user expense burger to expenses.csv. Sure enough, if I look at my file explorer, I've got an expenses.csv here. And if I double click that, you'll see that my entry has appeared. Now let's check what happens if we add another item to it. So we'll run it again, and this time I'm going to add sushi, $20, and then also food. And you can see it shows up in this file. That's great. Now let's make a third one just to make sure that other categories work as well, because I've just used food twice. So let's use electricity. And then maybe $120, and then this could be, I guess, home. So now we have 3 expenses and our file is steadily growing. But if we want to reset it at any time, we could just delete the file and it will recreate it. Now let's build out the last part of the project, which is to summarize all of the expenses. So we'll have to read the same file that we just wrote to, gather all of these data, turn them back into an expense object so that we can do math on the actual amount. And then maybe we want to summarize it by category, or maybe we just want to get the total. But let's go ahead and do that first. So we'll have to use with open again, and then we've got the same file path here. But this time we're opening it as a read-only mode. And we want to read each line. So if we use the readLines function, this will actually give us a list we can enumerate. And that's probably fine for now. So we're just going to do lines equals readLines. And now this is going to be a list of strings where each item is going to be equal to one of these things. So let's do this for line in lines. We're going to loop again. I'm just going to print out the line. See what the line looks like. So let's run this and make sure we're good so far. Enter a new expense. So I'm going to call it gas, $70, and then maybe work. Okay, so now we're printing out the lines. And you can see that there's actually an additional space between each one. The reason is because when we read these lines, we're also reading the new line character that we can't see here, but it's causing a new line to occur. And because print also adds a new line every time we use it with different strings, that's why we have a double gap for each of these. But it doesn't matter. Right now, we want to break this up and take these values and put them back into an expense object. So let's create an expenses list to store each of these results. And first, I need to take away this new line character and any kind of space or things like that that are before and after this. So strings actually have an inbuilt function to do that, and it's called strip. So I'm going to call it stripped line equals line.strip. And if you look at this function, it says return a copy of the string with leading and trailing white space removed. So that will remove spaces, new lines, and things like that. And you're not expected to know this kind of stuff right away, but my general advice for if you come across a problem like this is first, just go online or go on Google or ChatGPT and just search for how do I do this. It's only when you start to get to unique problems that you might have to write your own solution. But for extremely common problems, such as stripping white space from a line, there's usually a very simple solution that you can just find by searching. So once we have the stripped line, it's basically going to be one of these things without the new line here. And now we have to break this up into 3 elements. And we can do that easily because we know that we break it on the comma. And just like I said, if you don't know how to do something like that, just search it up on Google. In fact, let's go and do that together now. And we can type in something like how to split line by comma in Python. And if you look at one of the first results that come up, there would usually be some kind of article or some explanation that tells you how to do it. And in this one, it says to use the Python string split method. And so we can split a string by specifying the separator that we want to use. So here's the example. This is the example text, and it looks similar to us because it uses a comma as well, and it can use this split function with this comma in order to break this up into separate strings. So we could do that here. And we can call it something like line elements, and then we'll do line dot split, and we'll put in our comma. And so this line elements is probably going to be a list or a tuple, because that's what this will return. But if you remember from our tuples chapter, we can actually unpack it into 3 separate variables, because we know that this is always going to be 3 elements in this tuple. We're not going to be surprised by 4 elements or 5 elements or anything like that. So instead of calling it line elements, we can actually unpack it right away. Expense name, then we put expense amount as the second one, and then the expense category. And just the sanity check, let's actually print all these out. Oh, and I should be using the stripped line instead of the line, because remember, this returns a new line. It doesn't actually modify this one. So I have to do this, otherwise I'll just be calling split on the original line, and then I'll get that new line character that I don't want. But also, instead of doing this in 2 lines, we could actually basically chain these functions, because this returns the stripped line. Instead of doing it on its own line here, we could do something like this. So line, strip it, and then split it. So I don't know which one you prefer, but yeah, let's go with this one for now. And now let's run that to make sure everything still works. I'm running out of expense ideas. Let's just say coffee. And I don't know, maybe miscellaneous? Okay, so this is the result from this print statement, and it seems to work. We seem to have each of these separated into its own variable. Now let's actually create the expense object from it and put it back in here. So let's go ahead and do line expense. And then we'll just to the expense constructor. And similar story, we're just going to pass in each of our arguments. So now I can delete this and just print out the line expense instead. But I also want to add it back to this list. So let's add it to the list. And once we're done reading that file, we're going to print out the entire expense list just to make sure that everything made it in there. By the way, just to make this a little bit easier to run, I don't want to have to enter and save the expense every time I'm doing this anymore, so I'm just going to comment those out. And when I run this app, we're just going to try to summarize the expense. So that's one of the advantages of breaking the programs into small functions, is that when you test it, you can test each function on its own if you design it that way. So now I don't have to enter anything, it's just going to work on my previous input, and that will save us some time. So let's refresh that and run that again. I have a problem here because I try to use a format code F for type string. Well, that's because when I read this amount, this is still a string, remember? When I strip the line, all of these are strings. So even the amount here is maybe like, 12.0 or whatever, that is still 12.0 as a string and not 12.0 as a float. So we're going to have to cast it here. Okay. Now let us run that again, and this time it works. We have the expenses printed out one by one, so there's 5 of them, and we also have the list of the expenses printed out. So now we're ready to start summarizing and providing useful data back to our user. And let's delete these print statements because we don't need it anymore. And I'm going to collapse this as well, just so that we don't have to see that. We can work with the expenses. So the first thing I want to do is maybe get the expense by category. And I can do that by using a dictionary, because a dictionary, I can look up an item by its key. So I could use the category string as the key, which means that I will only have 5 items in the dictionary. And for the value, I could use a running total of how much I've spent for that category. So my strategy is to go through each item in my list, each of these 5 items, and then if I find this key in my dictionary, I will add this number to the existing value. But if I don't find that key, then I'm going to add a new value equal to this number. So let's go ahead and try that out. I'm going to call the dictionary amount by category, because that's what it is. And I'm just going to do an empty dictionary to start with. Now I want to loop through each expense. So for expense in expenses, the key is going to be the expense category. And you could see here my type hint is gone again. So if I press that, I don't get my hints anymore. That's because Python hasn't figured out that this expense is actually one of these expense class objects. And it can't do that, or we can't, I don't think we can do this here like this. Like, it's not happy with that. But it can figure it out if we tell Python what this thing is, because we declare that here. So I could do something like this, but this won't work because this is saying that this is one expense, but actually it's a list of expenses. So if you're using Python 10 and above, you can actually type list like this as an expense, and this will tell Python that this variable is a list of expenses, so that when we do loop it, we get our type hints. And if you're not using Python 3.10, you can still do this, but it's a little trickier. You have to instead type list in capitals, and then you have to import this library. So if you click on Quick Fix, you'll say import from typing import list. So that's the line you need to make that work. But I am using Python 3.10, so I'm just going to undo that and then use this lowercase, and then you don't have to import anything. So now I have my type hints. Let's go back to this. I'm going to have the key as my expense category. This is going to be the key for my dictionary. First, we have to check if the key already exists. And if it does, we basically just add it together with the new expense. So we'll use the plus equals operator, which means take this value and then add this value on the right-hand side and then assign it back into this value. And the amount we're going to add it by is the expense amount. And make sure you're using the actual expense object we're looping through here and not these other values that we previously used here, because it can be quite easy to mix them up. So that's what we do if the key is there. We update the value. But if the key isn't there, then we need to create this entry. And we can just copy this line, really. But instead of plus equals, we'll just do equals. So we're creating a new entry, and it's going to equal to the expense amount. That will be our starting value for that category. So by the end, we should really have a dictionary where the key is the category and the value is the expense total for that category. Let's go ahead and print this out. So when I run it, you can see that it shows up like this instead. I've spent $32 on food, $120 on home, $70 on work, and miscellaneous is 5. And if I want to print this in a nicer looking way, I could just loop through it as well. So I'll loop through for key and then maybe amount in expenses. Wait, hold on. Amount by category is my dictionary. So amount category dot items. This will give me the key and the amount for each item in this map or in this dictionary that you see here. And then we're just going to use our format string to print nicely. So a couple of spaces just to kind of indent it so it stands out. And then we'll put in the key. Then we'll put in the amount and we'll format that nicely as well. So we'll put in that $sign and then we'll say amount, then do the string formatting. Okay, and we might preface this with a heading. So I'm just going to say print expenses by category. And let's run that. And now you could see it prints nicely on each line and we can see them here. Now for the final part of this project, I want to also keep track of my budget. So let's say I have a budget amount. Maybe I'll pass this in as a variable actually. And I will calculate how much I have left in my budget. So I need to sum all of these amounts that I'm going through. And I could do that in this loop or I could do that in this loop. It doesn't matter. I'll probably just do it here because in this part, I'm just showing information and I don't want to sort of mix up that logic. So to show the remaining budget, first I have to work out the total of everything that I've spent. And I could do that either here or here since I'm already looping through those items. but it's usually better not to do two things in one place if it's part of a different problem. Here we're trying to sort the expense by category, and here we're trying to print them out. Even though we can kind of cram in extra logic to get the total expenses, I don't like to do that because it confuses things that should be separate. So let's just do it on the next line, and we are going to sum it all over again. And we're going to say total spent equals, and there's actually a handy function in Python to do this quickly for us. So it's called sum. Sum takes a list as an argument. So we're going to use list comprehension to go through these expenses and get their amounts. And this is how it looks. Don't worry if this looks a little bit confusing at first. We're going to do expense, well, X for expense. I'm just keeping it short. And then we do X amount. So this is saying that for every expense in the expenses, we're going to create a new list where each item in the list is equal to the expenses amount. So basically this line will become a list of just the dollar value of each expense. And usually this name here, it's you could write it fully like this if you want, but it's quite long already. So I'm just going to use X because it's just in one line. So I don't need the name to be too descriptive. And this will sum everything up for us in this list. So the sum function accepts a list as an argument, and it will basically add all those numbers together and put it into this variable. And let's format this as well. So now we'll say you've spent this much amount this month, and I want to work out how much money we have left. But to do that, I'll need a budget, which I haven't passed in through here yet. So let's create a budget. Let's set it at $2,000. And then we'll have to pass it in with this variable. And now we'll go back to our function and use it. So remaining budget is simply equal to the budget minus the total spent. If you really want to make the app nice, you might think of what to do if this becomes negative. Like, do you want to set this 0, or do you want to keep it negative to say that, hey, you've gone over budget by this much? Up to you. I'm not going to do anything with it yet because we're kind of just going out of scope now. So I'm just going to leave it like this, and I'll print this out as well. And I'm going to copy that line and say budget remaining. Actually, I'm going to make them consistent like this, and I'll probably add emojis to them as well, just because I like to have a visual indicator. Oh, and don't forget to update the format value. Okay, let's go ahead and run it. And now it says total spent $227, remaining budget 1,700 something. So now that we have the total budget remaining, let's see if we can work out how much we have to spend each day. But this is going to use some knowledge that we don't yet have. We have to figure out from Python how many days there are left in the month. So here I'm going to ask ChatGPT how to get a day of the month in Python. So after I asked ChatGPT that, it's shown me this code snippet, and it's provided me some explanation on how to do it. So I can import this datetime module that's inbuilt into Python, and I could just do it in 2 lines of code. But because ChatGPT is so powerful, I could probably just ask it to tell me how to get the remaining days, the number of remaining days in the month. So let's go ahead and try that. So here I'm asking it how to get the remaining number of days of the current month in Python. So it's given me the code snippet and it's explaining all this stuff. But I don't think I need to see the explanation now, so I'm just going to hit stop generating, and I'm just going to copy this code snippet. First, I'm going to need to copy these import statements and put it at the top of my file. So let's go ahead and do that. And now let's import this part, which will actually get the remaining days of the month. So we'll scroll all the way back down to our budget calculation, and then we'll paste that, fix the indentation so it's at the right level. And I'm just going to read the code. It's always good if you're getting code from somewhere else to read it, make sure that it makes sense. So we're getting the current date, and then we're getting the number of days in the current month. So it's doing this, and then we just subtract it, days in the month minus the day. So now we have the remaining days. Okay, so I don't think I need these comments anymore. now I can print the remaining budget for each day. So that would probably just be remaining budget divided by remaining days. And I can print that out. Okay, so let's test that. And then if I run it, it says my budget per day is 61. And it tells me the remaining days in the current month is 29. And that's accurate because today is the 2nd. So let me just delete this print statement. And now I only have the things that I'm printing out. So that was pretty good. My summary function is probably the most complex function that we've written here, but it seems to do its job. We read the file, we get the expenses by category, the total expenses, the budget remaining, and the budget per day to stay in budget for the rest of the month. Now, if you are writing a command line app that prints into the terminal like this, and you want some numbers to stand out more, you can actually make the terminal show these in a different color. And you could do that by adding special characters to the string that you're printing. It's actually pretty easy. Now, this is not something I memorize or know, but I just copy snippets from the internet whenever I need to do this. So here is the special set of characters you need to use to turn a piece of text into a certain color. And here it turns it into a green color. So I've created this function called green, and it takes in a string, and it will return a new string with the special characters to make that appear green in the terminal. So I could use this function now to make things stand out. And I could use it here like this, so I can wrap this entire string into a function. And now if I run that again, you'll see that my budget per day is highlighted in green. So that's just a small trick you can use to boost the visual appeal of your terminal apps. Now to wrap this up, let's uncomment all the other functions we commented out earlier. And let's run this as one app end-to-end just to test the entire functionality of it. Make sure everything works. And so we'll run it again, and I'll have to add in a new expense. So let's say I had to spend money on a haircut, and maybe this is $20, and I guess this would be in miscellaneous as well. And so now this is updated. It tells me the total spent and how much I can spend per day to stay in budget. If I go to my expense CSV file, I can import this into Google Drive or into Microsoft Excel, and it will actually be a table. So if you build an app like this, you can use it to build integrations with other workflows you might have by using CSV files. And that's pretty much it for the project. We have implemented everything that we've set out to do. So that pretty much wraps up our expense tracking app project. I hope you now feel more comfortable with the problem-solving process of taking some business requirements like what we had for the app at the beginning and breaking them up into smaller problems and smaller pieces of Python that we can write and test individually. Also, we encountered a problem that we haven't seen before, which is how to calculate the remaining days within the month. And you will typically always come up against problems that you've never seen before or you don't know how to solve. And that's just a normal thing. So your goal shouldn't be to know everything or to know how to solve all problems. Instead, your focus should be how to find out how to solve problems. And we saw that it's really easy. Most of the time, it's just a matter of searching Google or ChatGPT or looking in the right places for the solution. So you can apply that process to future projects you want to do. You don't need to know how to do all of it. Maybe 70, 80% is enough. And then you'll figure out the remaining 20% that you don't know as you're working on the problem. If you struggle with the code or you need an example, then check the comments in the video because I'm going to link the GitHub project with the entire code that we just wrote here so that you can see that in your browser directly and compare it. And if you get stuck or if you need any help, then leave a question in the comments and I'll answer it so that you know what to do next. If you've made it all the way through this tutorial series, then congratulations, you're at the end and now you know how to use Python at a basic level. You're ready to go and take on more intermediate and advanced projects, more tutorials or more projects, and start building up that skill so that you can become a successful software engineer or a successful Python programmer. And if you're looking for more tutorials like these, or you want to try bigger projects or more advanced projects, then please head over to my YouTube channel page where I'm constantly updating it with new projects in Python, but also with different other languages, with cloud programming. If you like these tutorials and you want to learn more from me, check out these videos, check out this playlist. Otherwise, I hope you found this useful, and thank you for watching.